Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting into the world of ancient Greece. A land of olive groves, sunlit temples, and stories that shaped the very roots of Western civilization. We'll stroll through the echoing agoras of Athens, listen to the musings of philosophers under the stars, and sail across the shimmering Aegean alongside poets, warriors, and curious thinkers who changed the way we see the world. But before we dive in, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love the story. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Now, lower your lights, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background, and settle in. Let's ease into tonight's quiet journey together. The story of ancient Greece begins not in the majestic marble temples or bustling city-states that often dominate historical imagination, but far earlier, in a more modest setting, when the Bronze Age was still young and human communities were scattered, humble, and slow in their progress. Around the year 3000 BCE, small settlements began to emerge in the region that would one day be known as Greece. These communities were typically located near coasts or fertile valleys, which offered a combination of arable land, access to fresh water, and proximity to the sea. The people of this early era lived simple lives. They cultivated grains, tended to sheep and goats, and gradually learned to work with bronze, a metal alloy formed from copper and tin, which marked the beginning of what we now call the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age was characterized not by dramatic changes, but by a slow and steady improvement in tools, agricultural productivity, and population growth. Small hamlets gave way to larger villages. Pottery improved in design and function. Trade began to link distant settlements, and with trade came ideas. Over centuries, a complex web of cultural interaction took root in the Aegean, stretching from the Greek mainland to the islands of the Aegean Sea, and as far as Anatolia and the Levant. The earliest significant civilization to rise in this region was the Minoan civilization, located on the island of Crete. The Minoans flourished from approximately 2600 to 1400 BCE. Their civilization was centered around large palace complexes, the most famous of which is located at Knossos. These palaces were not only the administrative centers of Minoan society, but also served religious, economic, and political purposes. They were vast, labyrinthine structures with multiple stories, intricate plumbing systems, and extensive storerooms. The Minoan palaces featured frescoes, wall paintings depicting scenes of everyday life, nature, religious rituals, and athletic competitions such as bull leaping. These frescoes give us glimpses of a society that valued ceremony, display, and perhaps peace, since there is little evidence of fortification around their cities. The Minoans used a writing system known as Linear A. Unfortunately, Linear A remains undeciphered, and so much of what we understand about the Minoans is derived from archaeological evidence rather than written texts. They were skilled seafarers, and their ships carried goods such as pottery, olive oil, and perhaps textiles across the eastern Mediterranean. Minoan influence can be detected on the Greek mainland, in Egypt, and in the Levant, indicating that they played a major role in regional trade networks. However, the Minoan civilization did not last. Around the year 1450 BCE, most of the major Minoan palaces were destroyed. The reasons for this are debated. One theory is that a massive volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera, modern Santorini, caused widespread destruction through tsunamis and ash fallout. This eruption, one of the largest in recorded history, certainly devastated local environments. Whether the eruption directly caused the fall of the Minoan civilization is not certain. It is also possible that the Mycenaeans, another emerging Bronze Age civilization on the Greek mainland, conquered the Minoans, seizing control of their trade networks and administrative systems. Whatever the cause, the Minoan palaces fell into decline, and power shifted northward to the mainland. The Mycenaean civilization, which arose around 1600 BCE and lasted until approximately 1100 BCE, represents the first advanced Greek-speaking culture. The Mycenaeans were centered in fortified palace complexes such as Mycenae, Tiryns, Polis, and Thebes. These citadels were situated on elevated ground and surrounded by enormous stone walls made of limestone blocks so large that later Greeks believed they had been constructed by the mythical Cyclopes. The Mycenaeans ruled through a hierarchical system with a central king, referred to as a wanax, at the top, followed by local governors, officials, scribes, craftsmen, and laborers. The economic and political activities of the palace were recorded on clay tablets using Linear B, an early form of Greek writing that has been deciphered. These tablets reveal a society deeply engaged in administration, resource allocation, and military organization. The Mycenaeans were not only administrators but also warriors. Their elite class buried their dead in elaborate tombs filled with grave goods, including gold masks, swords, and imported materials. These burial practices, particularly the shaft graves of Mycenae and the later tholos or beehive tombs, indicate a culture that valued martial prowess and hierarchical status. They also built extensive roads and infrastructure that connected their palaces and trade centers. Trade was important to the Mycenaeans, just as it had been to the Minoans. Mycenaean pottery has been found across the Mediterranean, from the Levant to Sicily. The Mycenaeans likely traded oil, wine, and metals, and in return imported luxury items and raw materials. They maintained contact with Egypt and the Hittite Empire, and there is evidence of both diplomatic and hostile encounters. A key feature of Mycenaean culture is its contribution to Greek mythology and epic literature. The Mycenaeans were likely the inspiration for the legends that were passed down orally through generations and later written down by poets such as Homer. The great kings and warriors of the Iliad and the Odyssey, Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus, are thought to have lived in this era, though the details are certainly more myth than history. Nonetheless, these stories reflect the values of the Mycenaean elite: honor, bravery, loyalty, and the importance of familial and political alliances. Despite their achievements, the Mycenaean palaces suffered a series of catastrophic collapses between approximately 1200 and 1100 BCE. The causes of this widespread collapse remain the subject of debate. Some scholars suggest a period of widespread instability in the eastern Mediterranean, sometimes called the Late Bronze Age collapse. Evidence suggests that many civilizations, including the Hittites and cities in the Levant, also fell during this time. Contributing factors may have included natural disasters, internal revolts, economic breakdowns, and invasions by mysterious groups such as the Sea Peoples. In Greece, the palaces were burned and Linear B disappeared. The complex society of the Mycenaeans fragmented into smaller, more isolated communities. This ushered in a period known as the Greek Dark Age. From around 1100 to 800 BCE, Greek society became more rural and decentralized. Writing was lost and monumental architecture ceased. This era is poorly documented, hence the term dark. What we know about this period comes mainly from archaeological evidence. Simple pottery, small village sites, and a notable absence of large-scale political organization. Life during the Dark Age was likely difficult. Populations declined. Settlements were small and scattered. long-distance trade diminished. Many of the great palaces and cities were abandoned, and knowledge of past achievements was gradually forgotten. Yet this period was not without cultural activity. Oral traditions flourished. These included songs and stories about heroes, gods, and epic battles that kept the memory of the Bronze Age alive. These oral traditions would later form the basis for Greek mythology and literature. The burial practices of the Dark Age also hint at continued social stratification. Some individuals were buried with weapons and jewelry, suggesting that status and warrior culture remained important. Gradually, around the end of the 9th century BCE, conditions began to improve. Populations increased. Villages grew into towns. Pottery became more intricate, and iron tools replaced bronze. Contact with the Near East resumed, and new influences began to shape Greek society. Perhaps the most important development was the reintroduction of writing, based on the Phoenician alphabet. This adapted script, which included vowels, made literacy more accessible. It allowed for the recording of laws, transactions, and, most importantly, literature. By the end of the 8th century BCE, Greece was emerging from its long slumber. City-states began to form, each with its own political system, economy, and identity. Colonies were established around the Mediterranean. Trade networks were rebuilt. Greek religion began to take on a standardized form, with temples and festivals dedicated to a shared pantheon of gods. This transformation marked the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Archaic period. And so the Bronze Age, with its rising and falling civilizations, from the enigmatic Minoans to the warlike Mycenaeans, set the stage for the Greece that would eventually give birth to democracy, philosophy, and enduring cultural legacy. It is a period of long, gradual developments, of forgotten scripts and rediscovered myths, of palaces built and then destroyed, and of people who, despite the hardships of collapse, kept the memory of their ancestors alive in song and story. This quiet, winding story of the Bronze Age is not one of abrupt revolutions or dazzling kings, but rather of slow accumulation, of imperceptible shifts, and of civilizations that rose like waves only to recede and leave behind the groundwork for all that was to come. The Bronze Age is a fitting beginning for the history of a civilization that would, in time, echo across continents and centuries, not with the noise of empire, but with the rhythm of stories, stones, and memory. As the long and silent Dark Age gave way to the slow reawakening of society, the land we now call Greece began to experience a series of changes that, while subtle and uneven, marked the beginning of a new era. This period, which historians call the Archaic Age, spanned approximately from 800 BCE to 480 BCE. It was a time when the old world of palaces and kings had been replaced by something quite different, though no less significant. Small communities began to grow in population and complexity. Settlements that had once been little more than farming villages developed into structured societies, laying the groundwork for what would become city-states, or in Greek, polis. The term polis is central to understanding this age. A polis was not merely a city in the geographical sense, but a political and social unit that included the surrounding countryside, the people who lived there, and the communal institutions that bound them together. Each polis had its own government, laws, customs, and military. Although they shared a common language, religious beliefs, and cultural practices, the various Greek polis often operated with complete independence from one another. Over time, hundreds of polis would emerge across the Greek mainland, the islands, and even along the coasts of Asia Minor and beyond. The development of the polis was gradual. There were no sudden revolutions or dramatic innovations. Rather, over generations, elders and chieftains were replaced by councils, assemblies, and magistrates. The economy began to diversify. In addition to subsistence farming, people began to engage in trade, crafts, and production of goods such as pottery, textiles, and metalwork. Markets or agoras became central gathering places not only for economic exchange but also for social and political life. One of the most important developments of the Archaic Age was the revival of writing. Around the 8th century BCE, the Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet and modified it to suit their own language. This new alphabet included vowels, which made reading and writing significantly easier than previous systems. With this tool, Greeks could record poems, laws, treaties, inventories, and more. Most famously, this allowed for the transcription of oral epic poetry. The two great epic poems, attributed to the blind poet Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were written down during this period. These works, though reflecting a world long past, became foundational texts of Greek culture and education. Religion also played a central role in the life of the polis. The Greeks worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses who were believed to dwell on Mount Olympus. These included Zeus, the king of the gods, Hera, his wife, Poseidon, god of the sea, Athena, goddess of wisdom, Apollo, god of the sun and music, Artemis, goddess of the hunt, Ares, god of war, Aphrodite, goddess of love, and many others. Each polis had its own patron deity and built temples in their honor. Religious festivals were a regular part of life, and many involved athletic competitions, sacrifices, and communal feasts. These religious practices helped to unify communities and create a shared sense of identity. As populations grew, land became a source of tension. In many polis, land was owned by aristocratic families who claimed descent from legendary ancestors. These aristocrats controlled politics and wealth, often at the expense of poorer farmers. As a result, social unrest was common. Some farmers fell into debt and were forced into slavery. Others left their homes in search of new opportunities. This led to another major development of the Archaic Age, colonization. Beginning in the 8th century BCE, Greek polis began establishing colonies across the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. These colonies were independent settlements, not ruled directly by the mother polis, though they often maintained cultural and religious ties. Colonies were established in southern Italy and Sicily in North Africa, along the coast of modern-day Turkey, and as far as modern France and Spain. This expansion allowed for the spread of Greek culture, increased trade, and the alleviation of population pressure at home. The rise of the hoplite soldier was another defining feature of the Archaic Age. A hoplite was a heavily armed infantryman who fought in a tightly packed formation called a phalanx. Each hoplite carried a round shield, a spear, and a short sword. The phalanx relied on discipline, cohesion, and mutual protection. In this formation, individual bravery was less important than the ability to hold the line and support one's comrades. Hoplite warfare reflected the values of the polis: order, cooperation, and shared responsibility. Because hoplites were typically drawn from the middle class, those who could afford their own armor, this form of warfare also gave rise to increased demands for political participation among non-aristocratic citizens. As a result, many polis underwent political reforms. The most famous of these occurred in Athens. In the 7th century BCE, Athens was ruled by aristocrats who monopolized political power, but tensions between classes led to the appointment of reformers. One such reformer was Draco, who codified the laws of Athens in the early 7th century BCE. His laws were known for their harshness, and the term draconian still reflects that severity. A later reformer, Solon, enacted more balanced changes around 594 BCE. He canceled debts, freed those enslaved due to debt, and created a system that allowed citizens to participate in government based on wealth rather than birth. While Solon's reforms did not establish full democracy, they laid the foundation for future political change. Other polis developed in different directions. Sparta, located in the region of Laconia in the Peloponnesus, followed a unique path. In the early Archaic Age, Sparta conquered its neighbors and turned the population of Messenia into helots, state-owned serfs who worked the land and provided food for the Spartan elite. To maintain control over this large and resentful population, Sparta developed a militarized society. Boys were taken from their families at a young age and trained in discipline, endurance, and combat. The Spartan state was ruled by 2 kings, a council of elders, and an assembly of citizens, though real power rested with a small group of elites. Spartan values emphasized austerity, obedience, and communal loyalty over individual expression. Despite their differences, Greek polis shared many cultural traits. Athletic competition was one of these shared traditions. In 776 BCE, the first Olympic Games were held at Olympia in honor of Zeus. These games included running, wrestling, discus throwing, and other events. The Olympics became a regular festival held every 4 years, drawing participants from across the Greek world. Other Pan-Hellenic festivals, such as those at Delphi and Nemea, also celebrated athletic prowess and reinforced cultural unity. Art and architecture in the Archaic Age began to develop in distinctive ways. Pottery featured geometric patterns, scenes from mythology and daily life. Statues of young men, known as koroi, and young women, called korai, were created in a stiff and formal style, often with a characteristic archaic smile. Temples were built using stone and featured columns and pediments. The architectural orders, Doric, Ionic, and later Corinthian, began to emerge during this time, though they would not reach their classical forms until the following period. Another important institution of the Archaic Age was the symposium. This was a private gathering of elite men who would recline on couches, drink wine, recite poetry, play music, and engage in philosophical conversation. Symposia were both social and intellectual occasions, reflecting the values and interests of the aristocracy. Poetry became an important medium for personal expression during the Archaic period. Poets such as Sappho of Lesbos, Alcaeus, and Archilochus composed verses that dealt with love, politics, warfare, and the complexities of human emotion. Philosophical thought also began to emerge during the Archaic Age, especially in the Ionian cities of Asia Minor. Thinkers such as Thales of Miletus, Anaximander, and Heraclitus began to explore natural phenomena without relying solely on mythological explanations. They asked questions about the origins of the universe, the nature of matter, and the underlying principles of change. These early philosophers, often referred to as pre-Socratics, laid the groundwork for rational inquiry and scientific thought. The late Archaic period was also marked by increasing conflict. Rivalries between polis, disputes over land and trade, and internal political struggles led to frequent warfare. Some polis fell under the control of tyrants, individuals who seized power by force or popular support. These tyrants were not always oppressive. Many enacted reforms, sponsored public works, and promoted the arts. However, their rule was often unstable and gave way to more structured forms of governance. As the Archaic Age drew to a close, two great powers began to dominate the Greek world: Athens and Sparta. Their differing political systems, values, and ambitions would set the stage for future conflicts. Meanwhile, a new threat was emerging from the east. The Persian Empire, under kings such as Cyrus the Great, Cambyses II, and Darius I, was expanding its territory. In 546 BCE, the Persians conquered the Greek cities of Asia Minor. This brought the Greek world into direct contact and ultimately into conflict with the largest empire the world had yet seen. By the year 500 BCE, the Archaic Age had transformed the Greek world. From scattered villages had grown vibrant city-states. From oral tradition had come written literature. From tribal elders had emerged political institutions. From isolated communities had arisen colonies spanning the seas. The Greeks had begun to think not only about how to live, but about why life was the way it was. The stage was set for the Classical Age, the era of philosophers, playwrights, wars, and the birth of democracy. But before all that, there was the Archaic Age, a time of slow and steady formation, of growing pains and cautious steps, of people rediscovering what it meant to build a civilization from the ashes of memory. As the Archaic Age drew to a close, the Greek world stood on the edge of transformation. What followed was the Classical Age of ancient Greece, a period that stretched from approximately 480 BCE to 323 BCE. This era was characterized by flourishing arts, monumental achievements in philosophy, the height of political experimentation, and protracted conflict. It was during this period that the city of Athens reached its cultural zenith, that Sparta exerted its military dominance, and that the entire Greek world became embroiled in wars that would leave indelible marks on the fabric of Hellenic society. While the achievements of this era are often celebrated, the story of the Classical Age is equally a story of tension, rivalry, and eventual decline. The Classical Age was ushered in by the Persian Wars. The seeds of this conflict had been sown earlier when the Persian Empire, under Cyrus the Great and later his successors, expanded westward, incorporating the Greek cities of Asia Minor into their vast dominion. These cities, particularly those in Ionia, found themselves under Persian control, though they maintained a degree of autonomy. In 499 BCE, several Ionian cities, including Miletus, revolted against Persian rule. This uprising, known as the Ionian Revolt, was supported by Athens and Eretria, who sent ships and troops to aid their fellow Greeks. Although the revolt was ultimately crushed by the Persians, it enraged King Darius I, who sought to punish those who had interfered in his empire. In 490 BCE, Darius I launched an expedition to subdue the Greek mainland. His forces landed at the plain of Marathon, near Athens. The Athenians, under the command of Miltiades, faced the Persian army in battle. Despite being outnumbered, the disciplined hoplites of Athens secured a surprising and decisive victory. The Battle of Marathon became a symbol of Greek valor and resistance. According to tradition, a messenger named Phidippides ran from the battlefield to Athens to announce the victory, giving rise to the modern marathon race. 10 years later, in 480 BCE, Darius I's son and successor, Xerxes I, mounted a massive invasion. He assembled a vast army and navy, crossing the Hellespont on pontoon bridges and advancing into Greece. Several Greek polis formed a defensive alliance, led by Sparta and Athens. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, a small Greek force led by King Leonidas of Sparta attempted to hold back the Persian army. Though the Greeks were eventually overwhelmed, their stand became legendary. Meanwhile, the Athenian navy, under the leadership of Themistocles, engaged the Persian fleet in the Straits of Salamis. Using clever tactics and knowledge of the local geography, the Greeks inflicted a severe defeat on the larger Persian fleet. The following year, in 479 BCE, the Persians suffered further defeats at the battles of Plataea and Mycale, effectively ending their attempts to conquer mainland Greece. The Greek Polis, particularly Athens and Sparta, emerged from the Persian wars with enhanced prestige. Athens, having rebuilt its fleet and contributed significantly to the victories, now positioned itself as a leading naval power. In the aftermath of the Persian threat, Athens established the Delian League, a coalition of Greek city-states ostensibly formed to continue the fight against Persia and to protect against future attacks. Initially, member states contributed ships or money to a shared treasury. However, over time, Athens began to dominate the League, transforming it into an Athenian empire in all but name. The treasury was moved from Delos to Athens, and those who attempted to leave the League were met with force. This period of Athenian dominance is known as the Golden Age of Athens. Under the leadership of the statesman Pericles, Athens experienced a cultural and political flowering. Pericles, who held the office of strategos, general many times, encouraged democracy, supported the arts, and initiated an ambitious building program. The Parthenon, a temple dedicated to Athena, was constructed atop the Acropolis during this time. Sculptors such as Phidias and architects like Ictinus and Callicrates contributed to the grandeur of Athens. Democracy in Athens was not like modern democracy. Only free male citizens were allowed to participate. Women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded. Citizens voted directly in the assembly where they could debate and decide on laws, war, and other matters. Public officials were often chosen by lot, reflecting the belief in the equality of citizens. The courts were large and staffed by ordinary citizens serving as jurors. This system fostered civic participation, but it also relied heavily on the labor of slaves and the economic output of Athens' empire. Philosophy, drama, and the sciences flourished during this era. Thinkers such as Socrates began to question traditional beliefs and methods of knowledge. Socrates engaged in dialogue with fellow citizens, asking probing questions to stimulate critical thinking. Although he wrote nothing himself, his student Plato would later record his ideas. Drama also reached new heights, with playwrights such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides composing tragedies that explored themes of fate, justice, and the human condition. Comedy, too, emerged as a powerful genre, with Aristophanes mocking politicians and societal norms. Historians such as Herodotus, who wrote about the Persian Wars, and Thucydides, who chronicled the Peloponnesian War, sought to understand the causes and consequences of human actions. As Athens grew in wealth and power, tensions with Sparta increased. Sparta, a land-based military society, viewed Athens' naval empire and democratic government with suspicion. The two powers represented different models of Greek life. Sparta valued stability, discipline, and tradition. Athens prized innovation, debate, and expansion. These differences, coupled with competing alliances and territorial disputes, led to a series of conflicts that culminated in the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War, which lasted from 431 BCE to 404 BCE, was a prolonged and devastating conflict between Athens and its allies and Sparta and its allies. The war can be divided into several phases. The initial phase, known as the Archidamian War, saw Sparta invade Attica, the region surrounding Athens, while Athens used its navy to raid the Peloponnesian coast. A plague struck Athens in 430 BCE, killing a large portion of the population, including Pericles. The war settled into a stalemate. In 421 BCE, the Peace of Nicias was signed, but it proved short-lived. In 415 BCE, Athens launched the Sicilian expedition, a massive naval campaign to conquer Syracuse. The expedition ended in disaster. The Athenian fleet was destroyed, and thousands of soldiers were killed or enslaved. This loss severely weakened Athens. The final phase of the war, known as the Ionian or Decelean War, saw increased Persian involvement. The Persians, seeking to weaken Athens, provided support to Sparta. Sparta, under the leadership of Lysander, built a fleet that challenged Athenian naval supremacy. In 405 BCE, the Athenian fleet was destroyed at the Battle of Aegospotami. The following year, Sparta besieged Athens, and the city was forced to surrender. Its walls were torn down, its fleet was reduced, and its empire was dismantled. The Peloponnesians were left Greece deeply divided and weakened. Sparta attempted to dominate the Greek world, but its rule was resented. Briefly, Thebes rose to prominence, but no polis could maintain lasting supremacy. Throughout the 4th century BCE, Greek politics were marked by shifting alliances, wars, and political instability. Philosophers such as Plato and his student Aristotle continued to explore questions of ethics, governance, and knowledge. Plato founded the Academy, while Aristotle would later tutor Alexander the Great. In the northern region of Greece, a new power was rising. Macedon, under King Philip II, began to assert its influence. Unlike the fragmented Polis, Macedon had a centralized monarchy and a professional army. Philip II reformed the military, introducing the sarissa, a long spear, and developing a highly effective phalanx. He used diplomacy, marriage alliances, and military conquest to expand his territory. In 338 BCE, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip II defeated a coalition of Greek city-states, including Athens and Thebes. This victory marked the end of Greek independence and the beginning of Macedonian dominance. Philip II was assassinated in 336 BCE, and his son, Alexander III, ascended to the throne. Known to history as Alexander the Great, he would go on to create one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. But his conquests and the era they ushered in belong to the next chapter. The classical age of Greece, then, was a time of unparalleled cultural achievement and persistent conflict. It was an age of democracy and empire, of tragedy and triumph, of reason and war. Its legacy would echo through centuries of Western civilization. Yet, beneath the marble and the myth, it was also an era marked by division, inequality, and the limits of human ambition. The brilliance of Athens, the discipline of Sparta, the questions of Socrates, and the wars that reshaped the land. These elements combined to form a civilization that stood briefly in full flower before it fractured under its own weight. As the classical age came to a quiet and fractured end, the Greek world found itself under the influence of a new and rising force. Macedon, a kingdom to the north of the traditional Greek heartland, long considered a semi-barbaric fringe state by the southern Polis, had begun to exert a centralizing influence over the increasingly fragmented and war-weary Greek states. With the ascent of Philip II to the Macedonian throne and the subsequent rise of his son, Alexander III, who would come to be known to history as Alexander the Great, the Greek world would once again transform, not through internal revival or city-state politics, but through conquest, cultural diffusion, and the spread of Hellenic ideas across a wide and varied territory. This period, stretching from the death of Alexander in 323 BCE to roughly the Roman conquest of Greece in 146 BCE, is known as the Hellenistic Age. It marks a time of transition, expansion, and slow decline, not only of political independence but of the old structures and identities that had defined Greek civilization for centuries. Alexander III of Macedon came to the throne under dramatic and violent circumstances. His father, Philip II, who had successfully united the Greek city-states under Macedonian hegemony through a combination of military brilliance and shrewd diplomacy, was assassinated in 336 BCE. The assassination, which occurred during a wedding celebration, remains the subject of much speculation, though no definitive account exists. Following this event, the young Alexander inherited a kingdom that was both powerful and precarious. He moved swiftly to eliminate rival claimants and reassert Macedonian authority over the Greek Polis, some of which, like Thebes, had shown signs of rebellion following Philip's death. Thebes in particular resisted Alexander's control, and in response, he razed the city, leaving only temples and the house of the poet Pindar intact. The message was clear: Macedonian dominance was not to be questioned. Having secured his position at home, Alexander turned his gaze eastward. His stated aim was to avenge the earlier Persian invasions of Greece and to complete the Pan-Hellenic war against Persia that his father had begun. But it quickly became evident that his ambitions extended far beyond a mere punitive campaign. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor with an army that, while modest in size, was highly trained and disciplined. His first major battle took place at the Granicus River, where he defeated a Persian force, thereby opening Asia Minor to his advance. Alexander continued his march through the Persian Empire, defeating King Darius III in two key battles, first at Issus in 333 BCE and then at Gaugamela in 331 BCE. Both battles showcased Alexander's tactical ingenuity, his charisma as a leader, and the superior coordination of his Macedonian and allied Greek forces. After Gaugamela, the Persian Empire was effectively broken. Darius III fled and was later killed by one of his own satraps. Alexander then declared himself the rightful ruler of Persia. Yet Alexander did not stop at conquering Persia. He continued his campaign into Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator. There, he founded the city of Alexandria, which would go on to become one of the most significant centers of learning and culture in the ancient world. He then pushed further east, into the heartlands of the former Persian Empire, reaching Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, which he famously allowed his troops to sack and burn, allegedly as a symbolic gesture of revenge for Xerxes I's destruction of Athens over a century earlier. Alexander's ambition appeared limitless. He moved into Central Asia, campaigning in regions corresponding to modern-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. In these remote and mountainous areas, he encountered fierce resistance from local tribes. Nevertheless, through a combination of force, strategic marriages, and the establishment of cities, he maintained control. His most distant campaign took him into the Indian subcontinent, where he faced King Polis at the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BCE. Despite difficult conditions and unfamiliar terrain, Alexander secured a costly but decisive victory. However, his army, weary from years of campaigning, refused to go further east. Reluctantly, Alexander turned back. The return journey proved arduous. Alexander's forces traversed the harsh deserts of southern Iran, suffering great losses. Eventually, he returned to Babylon, where he began plans for new campaigns and further administrative reforms. But in 323 BCE, at the age of 32, Alexander fell ill and died. The exact cause of his death remains unknown, with theories ranging from malaria to poisoning, though no evidence definitively supports any one explanation. With his death, the unified empire he had forged began to unravel almost immediately. Alexander left no clear successor. His only legitimate heir, Alexander IV, was a child born after his death to his wife Roxana. A power struggle ensued among Alexander's generals, known collectively as the Diadochi, meaning successors. These individuals, who had served as companions and commanders during the campaigns, divided the empire among themselves in a series of wars that lasted for decades. Eventually, three major Hellenistic kingdoms emerged: the Seleucid Empire in Asia, the Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt, and the Antigonid Kingdom in Macedon and parts of Greece. The Seleucid Empire, founded by Seleucus I Nicator, encompassed a vast territory stretching from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. Governing such a diverse and expansive region proved challenging. The Seleucids attempted to maintain control through a network of satrapies or provinces, and founded numerous Greek-style cities to promote Hellenic culture. These cities served as administrative centers and helped spread Greek language, art, and customs across Asia. However, the Seleucid rulers often faced rebellions, both from native populations and from ambitious regional governors. In Egypt, Ptolemy I Soter, another of Alexander's generals, established a stable and enduring dynasty. The Ptolemaic kingdom blended Greek and Egyptian traditions. The Ptolemies presented themselves as pharaohs to their Egyptian subjects while maintaining Greek institutions and language among the elite. Alexandria, founded by Alexander and developed by the Ptolemies, became a beacon of Hellenistic culture. The city housed the famous Library of Alexandria, which aimed to collect all human knowledge in written form. Scholars from across the known world came to study there. The museum, a research institution rather than a display space, supported scientific inquiry in fields such as astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and geography. The Antigonid Kingdom, centered in Macedon, sought to maintain influence over the Greek city-states. However, Greek resistance remained strong, particularly in cities like Athens and Sparta. The Antigonids faced frequent conflicts with leagues of Polis, such as the Aetolian League and the Achaean League, which sought to preserve autonomy. Nonetheless, Macedon retained a significant role in Greek politics until the rise of Roman power in the West. The Hellenistic period was marked by a blending of cultures. Greek language and customs spread throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, influencing art, architecture, religion, and education. At the same time, Greek settlers and rulers adopted local customs. In cities from Bactria to Alexandria, one could find Greek-style theaters and gymnasiums alongside local temples and traditions. Deities were often syncretized. For instance, the Egyptian god Ammonius was identified with Zeus, while the Persian Ahura Mazda was interpreted through Greek frameworks. The result was a complex and dynamic cultural exchange. Art in the Hellenistic period took on new characteristics. Unlike the idealized forms of the classical era, Hellenistic art explored a wider range of subjects, including the elderly, the poor, children, and foreigners. Sculptures displayed emotion, movement, and naturalism. Famous examples include the Laocoon group, which depicts a Trojan priest and his sons being attacked by sea serpents, and the winged victory of Samothrace, a statue of the goddess Nike poised in motion. These works emphasized drama and realism. Philosophy also evolved during this period. In the uncertain and cosmopolitan world of the Hellenistic kingdoms, new schools of thought emerged that addressed personal ethics and how to live a good life amid political instability. The Stoics, founded by Zeno of Citium, taught that virtue and reason were the path to happiness and that individuals should accept their fate with equanimity. The Epicureans, led by Epicurus, argued that pleasure, defined as the absence of pain and disturbance, was the highest good. They emphasized friendship and simple living. Another school, the skeptics, questioned the possibility of certain knowledge altogether. Science and mathematics reached new heights. Archimedes of Syracuse made advances in geometry, physics, and engineering. He discovered principles of buoyancy and invented devices such as pulleys and war machines. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy using simple tools and observations. Hipparchus laid the foundations of trigonometry and created detailed star maps. Medicine also advanced, with physicians like Herophilus conducting anatomical studies in Alexandria. Despite these cultural achievements, the Hellenistic world was not free from conflict. The successor kingdoms frequently fought one another in shifting alliances. Dynastic struggles and court intrigues destabilized governments. Native populations often resisted Greek rule. The Seleucids lost territory to the Parthians in the east and struggled to control their vast lands. The Ptolemies experienced succession crises and internal revolts. The Antigonids contended with restive Greek cities. And the growing power of Rome. Rome, which had steadily expanded its influence in the Western Mediterranean, began to take an interest in Greek affairs. In a series of conflicts known as the Macedonian Wars, Rome gradually asserted control over Greece. The first of these wars began in 214 BCE, and by 168 BCE, after the decisive Battle of Pydna, Macedon was effectively defeated. The Roman general Lucius Aemilius Polis oversaw the dissolution of the Antigonid monarchy. In 146 BCE, following a rebellion in Corinth, the city was sacked by Roman forces. That same year, Carthage was destroyed in the west. These events marked the end of Greek political independence and the full integration of Greece into the Roman Republic. The Hellenistic age, though often viewed as a period of decline from the heights of the classical era, was in many ways a time of innovation, diversity, and cultural expansion. It saw the spread of Greek ideas across vast territories, the emergence of new philosophies, and the flowering of art and science. It was a time when cities thrived, when scholars traveled, and when the boundaries of the known world were pushed outward. Yet it was also a time of political fragmentation, dynastic feuds, and eventual subjugation. By the end of the Hellenistic age, the Greek world was no longer a collection of independent polis but part of a larger Roman world. Greek language and culture, however, remained influential. Roman elites studied Greek philosophy and literature. Greek tutors educated Roman children. Greek architecture and aesthetics shaped Roman public buildings and monuments. In this way, the legacy of the Hellenistic world lived on, not in political independence, but in cultural transmission. The age of Alexander and his successors came to a close not with a final battle or dramatic fall, but with a slow and steady absorption into the broader Mediterranean sphere. The cities remained. The libraries continued their work. The statues stood silently in courtyards and temples. But the world had changed. The old freedoms were gone. The age of empires had begun. As the last independent Greek cities fell under the steady hand of Roman expansion, a new phase in the history of ancient Greece unfolded. This phase, although no longer marked by sovereignty or political autonomy, would become one of transmission, absorption, and enduring influence. Greece, though conquered, would shape the very civilization that now ruled it. The transition from Hellenistic independence to Roman dominion was gradual, complex, and marked by both decline and preservation. The Greek world, once defined by the city-states of Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes, now became a province of a far-reaching empire, yet its intellectual and artistic achievements would not only survive but come to define the core of Roman culture. Following the Roman victory over the Antigonid dynasty in the Macedonian Wars, the administration of Greece changed significantly. The Romans, ever pragmatic, allowed many Greek cities a degree of internal autonomy. However, ultimate authority rested with Roman governors and proconsuls. The region of Achaia became a Roman province in 146 BCE, the same year in which Corinth was destroyed, its population enslaved, and its monuments looted. This moment, often marked as the formal end of independent Greece, was less the conclusion of Greek civilization than a shift in its expression. For the Roman elite, Greece was not merely a land of conquest, but a wellspring of culture, philosophy, and refinement. Many Roman senators and generals saw themselves as students of Greek wisdom. Greek became the language of intellectual discourse across the Eastern Roman Empire. One of the first Roman leaders to express deep admiration for Greek culture was Scipio Aemilianus, the general responsible for the destruction of Carthage and the sack of Corinth. Despite his role in conquering Greece, Scipio surrounded himself with Greek philosophers, including the Stoic Panetius. He saw in Greek learning a moral and ethical guide. This pattern would be repeated. Cicero, the famed Roman orator, studied Greek rhetoric and wrote admiringly of Socrates and Plato. Julius Caesar himself was educated in the Greek classics, and his nephew and successor, Augustus, embraced Greek art and literature as models of excellence. While Roman military and political power governed the Mediterranean, Greek philosophy, art, and science shaped the intellectual life of the empire. In cities like Athens, which had lost its former political clout but retained its cultural prestige, philosophical schools continued to attract students from across the empire. The Academy, originally founded by Plato, and the Lyceum, associated with Aristotle, remained centers of teaching and discussion. Stoicism and Epicureanism, both products of the Hellenistic period, found followers among Roman thinkers. Even emperors took an interest. Marcus Aurelius, one of the so-called five good emperors, was deeply influenced by Stoic philosophy, writing his meditations in Greek, not Latin. In architecture and urban design, Roman cities adopted the features of their Greek counterparts. Temples with columns, theaters, gymnasiums, and agoras all became standard features of Roman civic life, especially in the eastern provinces. In art, Roman sculptors created copies of classical Greek works. Much of what is known today about Greek sculpture comes not from original Greek pieces but from Roman reproductions. These copies were placed in Roman villas and public spaces, admired not only for their beauty but for their association with the refined Hellenic past. In literature, Greek authors continued to write and to shape genres that the Romans would emulate. Historians such as Polybius, a Greek taken to Rome as a hostage after the defeat of the Achaean League, wrote extensive accounts of Rome's rise. His works combined Greek historiographical methods with Roman subject matter. Plutarch, another Greek writer, composed parallel lives of Greek and Roman figures, offering moral lessons and character studies that were widely read and respected in both cultures. Lucian, a satirist, used Greek prose to critique both old superstitions and new intellectual trends. These authors demonstrated that Greek literary production did not vanish with independence but rather adapted to the new imperial context. Greek religion, too, left its mark. The Romans, with their generally inclusive and syncretic approach to deities, absorbed many aspects of Greek mythology. The Olympian gods were equated with Roman counterparts. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, Ares became Mars, Athena became Minerva, and so forth. Roman poets like Virgil and Ovid drew heavily on Greek mythological narratives. Ovid's Metamorphoses retold countless Greek myths in Latin verse, preserving stories of heroes, gods, and transformations that continued to echo through the centuries. In education, Greek language and literature were considered essential to a proper Roman upbringing. Elite Roman children were often taught by Greek tutors. Mastery of Homer, Hesiod, and the Greek tragedians was a sign of refinement. Rhetorical training, central to Roman public life, followed Greek models. Schools across the empire taught in Greek, especially in the eastern provinces. In this way, the Greek intellectual tradition was not merely preserved, but became a central feature of Roman cultural life. As the Roman Empire shifted into the Principate and later into the Dominate, the cultural integration of Greece continued. The Emperor Hadrian, who reigned in the early 2nd century CE, was especially fond of Greek culture. He traveled extensively through the eastern provinces and oversaw the rebuilding of Athens, including the completion of the great temple to Olympian Zeus. He was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries and styled himself as a philosopher king. His admiration culminated in the founding of the Panhellenion, an organization meant to unite the Greek cities in a shared cultural and religious identity under Roman rule. It was a gesture that signified both homage to the past and a new imperial reality. By the time of the 3rd century CE, the Greek East had become a vital and increasingly dominant part of the Roman Empire. When the empire was divided administratively between East and West, the Greek-speaking provinces formed the core of the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, Empire. Constantinople, founded by Constantine I in 330 CE, became the capital of this eastern half. Though officially Roman, the Byzantine Empire was culturally and linguistically Greek. The transition was gradual and seamless in many respects. The Greek Orthodox Church became the spiritual heart of the region. Greek theology, language, and liturgy defined the religious life of millions. Even as the Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century CE, the Byzantine Empire continued for nearly 1,000 years. Classical Greek texts were copied and preserved in Byzantine monasteries and libraries. Philosophers such as Proclus and John Philoponus continued to write in Greek, commenting on Plato and Aristotle and shaping medieval thought. When scholars from the West sought to rediscover classical knowledge during the Renaissance, it was often through the intermediary of Greek texts preserved and transmitted by Byzantine scholars. One of the most significant transmissions of Greek knowledge occurred through Islamic scholars in the medieval period. During the Islamic Golden Age, texts of Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, and Ptolemy were translated into Arabic, studied, and elaborated upon. Cities such as Baghdad and Cordoba became centers of learning. Later, these Arabic translations were rendered into Latin and brought to Western Europe, where they helped ignite the scholastic movement. Thus, Greek science, mathematics, and philosophy traveled from Athens to Alexandria, to Baghdad, to Toledo, and back to Paris and Oxford. The continuity of this intellectual chain ensured that Greek thought remained alive even in distant lands and languages. Meanwhile, in Greece itself, the legacy of antiquity remained visible, though often buried under layers of time. Temples crumbled, statues eroded, cities diminished in size and importance. Yet the traditions endured. The Greek language, though changed, was never lost. The Orthodox Church, heir to Byzantine Christianity, continued to use Greek in its liturgy. Festivals, folk traditions, and oral histories kept fragments of the ancient world alive in the memory of the people. By the time modern archaeology emerged in the 19th century, Greece was viewed through the lens of classical nostalgia. European travelers and scholars, inspired by Homer, Plato, and Pericles, journeyed to Greece in search of ruins and relics. The rediscovery of sites like Delphi, Mycenae, and Knossos revealed layers of history long forgotten. Statues, vases, inscriptions, and architectural fragments were unearthed, catalogued, and displayed in museums. The material culture of ancient Greece, once entombed in earth and memory, was revived as an object of fascination and study. The modern Greek state, established in the early 19th century after a war of independence against the Ottoman Empire, embraced this classical legacy as part of its national identity. Athens became the capital, not merely for its central location, but for its symbolic connection to the glory of the past. Schools taught the classics. Monuments were restored. The Parthenon, though damaged and weathered, stood once again as a symbol of continuity. Yet the legacy of ancient Greece is not confined to its physical remains or national symbolism. It lives in ideas, the concept of democracy, the practice of philosophical inquiry, the disciplines of history, rhetoric, and logic. It lives in the dramatic structure of Western literature, in the architecture of courthouses and universities, in the vocabulary of science and politics. Terms like academy, ethics, cosmos, logic, democracy, and theater trace their roots to Greek origins. Even the alphabet used to write these words owes much to the Greek script. In the grand sweep of history, ancient Greece occupies a paradoxical place. It was never a vast empire in the manner of Rome or Persia. Its political structures were fragmented and frequently unstable. Its military dominance was short-lived, and yet, through language, culture, and ideas, its influence proved far more durable. The city-states faded, but the polis lived on in political theory. The temples crumbled, but the gods became symbols in poetry and art. The philosophers died, but their questions remained. So, in the quiet of a fading evening, one might picture the stones of Delphi cooling in the twilight, the wind brushing over the ruins of Corinth, the sea lapping against the harbor of Piraeus. In those places, time continues its gentle passage, but the echoes remain. The voice of Socrates questioning, the laughter of Aristophanes echoing, the geometry of Euclid forming silent patterns in the minds of students. Greece, no longer a power, became a presence, subtle, persistent, eternal, and thus concludes the story of ancient Greece. From the shadowed palaces of Mycenae to the bustling agora of Athens, from the campaigns of Alexander III to the scrolls of Alexandria, from conquest to collapse, and from memory to myth, it endures. In stone, in speech, and in sleep, Greece continues to speak. When one looks upon the landscape of modern Greece, its olive-dotted hills, its whitewashed villages, its crumbling columns standing sentinel above shattered marbles, one might be forgiven for thinking that the story of ancient Greece is confined to the distant past. Yet the journey of that civilization did not simply end with the ruins of the Hellenistic age or the absorption under Rome. Instead, like a faint melody carried on a breeze long after its composer has departed, the essence of Greece endured, sometimes lost to memory, sometimes buried under layers of earth, and sometimes preserved in unexpected ways, only to resurface in centuries to come. This chapter traces the slow, deliberate process by which the stones of antiquity were unearthed, the ideas of the ancients rekindled, and the legacy of ancient Greece woven into the fabric of the modern world. In the early centuries following the fall of the Byzantine Empire in the 15th century, much of Greece was subsumed under Ottoman rule. During these long centuries, the majestic remains of temples, theaters, and agoras stood largely neglected, their stones repurposed for new buildings, and their stories passed down in local legend and oral tradition. Peasants would tell of hidden treasures buried beneath the ruins of Mycenae, of pale marble heads lost in the vineyards, and of voices in the wind that sounded like ancient hymns. But these were whispers, fragile and scattered, easily dismissed by the demands of daily survival under a foreign administration. It was not until the Enlightenment of the 18th century that European scholars and travelers began to take a systematic interest in Greece. Drawn by accounts in Latin and French of Homer's epics and of the classical philosophers, young aristocrats embarked on the grand tour, making their way on arduous roads and by rattling carriages to the neglected sites of antiquity. They recorded their observations in diaries illustrated with crude sketches of truncated columns and toppled capitals. The poet Lord Byron, in the first half of the 19th century, famously joined the cause of Greek independence, partly moved by romantic ideals of resurrecting ancient glories. With the conclusion of the Greek War of Independence in 1843 and the establishment of the modern Greek state, archaeology began in earnest. European and Greek scholars formed committees to excavate the old cities. At Athens, the Acropolis itself was cleared of Christian churches and Ottoman barracks, revealing foundations of the Parthenon and the Erechtheion. At Delphi, the twin sanctuaries of Apollo and Athena were unearthed, casting new light on the religious heart of the ancient world. At Olympia, careful digging brought to view the stadium where, millennia ago, athletes had sprinted and wrestled in homage to Zeus. These early digs were painstaking and unhurried, conducted with rudimentary tools and under the hot sun. Each fragment of pottery was noted, each chipped piece of marble catalogued. Expeditions would last entire summers, returning to European universities clad in dust and bearing crates of inscribed stelae. Many of these finds found their way into national museums in Britain, France, Germany, and, of course, Greece itself. The manuscripts of Pausanias and Strabo guided these excavators, linking descriptions in ancient travel guides with the scattered ruins in the field. By the mid-19th century, a sense of pride in classical heritage had been woven into the identity of the new Greek nation. Architecture in Athens adopted neoclassical forms. Pediment porticos, fluted Doric columns, and triangular tympana. Public buildings, the parliament, the university, the academy, arose in imitation of Athenian prototypes. In the city squares, marble statues of Plato, Homer, and Philhellenes like Byron looked down upon bustling cafes where citizens discussed politics and poetry. Meanwhile, across Europe and the young United States, the influence of classical Greece permeated art, literature, and civic life. Universities established departments of classics in which young scholars read ancient Greek with painstaking care, parsing texts of Herodotus and Demosthenes. Civic leaders invoked Athens in speeches promoting public education and civic responsibility. The newly revived Olympic Games of 1896, held in Athens at the initiative of Baron Pierre de Coubertin, rekindled a ritual of peaceful competition among nations, reminding the world that the spirit of Olympia transcended time. In the 20th century, archaeological methods became more sophisticated. Stratigraphy revealed successive layers of occupation in cities like Corinth and Thebes. Radiocarbon dating placed Minoan Crete's zenith within a narrower window. Underwater archaeology off the coast of Kyrenia and Antikythera produced shipwrecks laden with ceramic wares and the discovery of the Antikythera mechanism hinted at Hellenistic technological ingenuity. Each advance in technique, from aerial photography to digital mapping, breathed new life into the silent stones. Yet archaeology was only part of the story. The traditions of philosophy, drama, and science that had once flourished in the agoras and academies of Greece found new interpreters. In libraries from Berlin to Boston, translations of Plato's dialogues and Aristophanes' comedies inspired modern philosophers and playwrights. The concept of democracy, first practiced in the stony assembly of Athens, was invoked in newly independent republics across the globe. The names Socrates, Aristotle, and Archimedes joined a pantheon of thinkers quoted in classrooms from Delhi to Sao Paulo. Art and architecture continued to draw upon Greek prototypes. The Greek revival style in the 18th and 19th centuries left villas in Savannah, courthouses in Melbourne, and civic buildings in Berlin bearing Ionic columns and sculpted friezes. Sculptors carved idealized nude figures in public parks, echoing the canon of Polykleitos. Painters rendered scenes from mythology, Perseus rescuing Andromeda, Prometheus bound to his rock, with a pre-Raphaelite attention to form and emotion that, ironically, revitalized the ancient myths for a modern audience. In education, the classical curriculum maintained a secure place well into the 20th century. Young scholars in Europe and North America dissected Greek sentences line by line, committing the Iliad and the Odyssey to memory alongside Plato's Apology. Debates over the relevance of such study, whether Latin and Greek formed the basis of intellectual rigor or merely served as elitist gatekeepers, raged in academic journals. Yet the ability to quote Pindar or parallel Pericles' funeral oration remained a badge of cultured attainment. As Greece entered the European Union in 1999, tourism became a major industry. Millions of visitors each year traveled to the Parthenon's marble columns, to the sun-bleached theaters of Epidaurus, and to the sunken sanctuaries of Delos. Each traveler carried away not only snapshots but also fragments of a story that had begun in the Bronze Age, advanced through the classical and Hellenistic eras, and survived the tides of conquest and neglect. Guidebooks in dozens of languages recounted the lives of rulers like Pericles I and emperors like Hadrian, placing them within a narrative accessible to any reader. Yet perhaps the most subtle and enduring memory of ancient Greece lies in the very language we speak. Words such as democracy, philosophy, theater, and academy derive directly from Greek roots. Scientific terms, geometry, biology, astronomy, bear the imprint of that language. Political discourse still invokes Athenian experiments in citizenship, and ethical debates hark back to Stoic and Epicurean meditations on the good life. In mathematics, students still study the postulates of Euclid and the methods of Archimedes. In medicine, the Hippocratic Oath, though revised, echoes a concern for the patient's welfare first articulated more than 2 millennia ago. In the 21st century, digital technology has opened new frontiers. Virtual reality recreates the Agora of Athens at the dawn of democracy. Three-dimensional scanning preserves fragile mosaics in remote Hellenistic villas. Open-access online libraries place translations of Hesiod and Herodotus on every screen. Scholarly articles now debate the nature of Mycenaean social structures based on isotope analysis of human remains. Even in the quiet of one's bedroom, the past is never more than a click away. Thus, the story of ancient Greece, once the slow unfolding of Bronze Age villages, the rise and fall of palace civilizations, the fluorescence of city-states, and the wide sweep of Hellenistic realms, finds its final chapter not in a single event, but in the continuous rediscovery and reimagining of those legacies. From the dusty notebooks of early antiquarians to the digital archives of modern universities, from the carved lintels of neoclassical buildings to the glowing screen of a smartphone, the echo of Greek thought and form endures. In this way, the ancient stones did more than crumble. They became the foundations upon which later generations built schools, governments, and works of art. They became symbols of ideals that outlived empires and of inquiries that transcend the ages. And so, in the hush between day and night, as the mind grows still and the body relaxes, one may close one's eyes and feel, however faintly, the pulse of that long-vanished world, still alive in memory, still shaping dreams, and still urging us to wonder at the slow, deliberate march of human achievement across the ages. In the quiet pathways of history, running parallel to the rise and fall of kingdoms and empires, there flows another current, the slow, deliberate unfolding of human thought, inquiry, and creative expression. In ancient Greece, this current was born first in the murmured debates under open skies, found its voice in formal schools and academies, and left its imprint on temples, theaters, and scrolls. This chapter traces that often gentle stream. Philosophy, science, drama, sculpture, and painting, showing how ideas grew, transformed, and endured, sometimes far from the tumult of politics and war. Even before the flowering of the classical era, in the towns and cities of the Archaic age, thoughtful individuals began to wonder about the nature of the world beyond myth and ritual. In the coastal cities of Ionia, Miletus, Ephesus, and others, early thinkers, later called the Milesian philosophers, asked questions about the origin of things. Thales of Miletus, around 600 years before the Common Era, proposed that water was the fundamental substance underlying all matter. His student Anaximander suggested a more abstract principle, the apeiron, the boundless, as the source of all things, an indefinite origin from which the cosmos emerged and to which it would return. Anaximenes, another Milesian, favored air as the primary element, its rarefaction and condensation giving rise to fire, water, and earth. These speculations, though simple by later standards, mark a turning point. The shift from explaining storms, earthquakes, and eclipses by appealing solely to capricious gods, to seeking natural principles that could be observed, reasoned about, and perhaps even measured. In time, other pre-Socratic figures, Pythagoras in southern Italy, Heraclitus in Ephesus, Parmenides in Elea, would add their own insights. Pythagoras found numerical harmony in musical intervals and celestial movements. Heraclitus spoke of constant flux, asserting that you cannot step into the same river twice. Parmenides, by contrast, argued for the unchanging nature of true being. Though these thinkers rarely wrote systematic treatises, and much of what we know comes from later commentators, their questions laid the groundwork for a tradition of rational inquiry. In Athens, during the 5th century BCE, this spirit of inquiry found its most dramatic expression in the figure of Socrates. Unlike his predecessors, Socrates wrote nothing. Instead, he wandered the agora marketplace and the shaded porticos of Athens, engaging anyone who would listen in dialogue. His method was simple. Ask a question, examine the answer, and follow where the logic led, often uncovering contradictions or revealing that professed knowledge was little more than opinion. Socrates claimed to know only that he knew nothing. In his relentless questioning, he turned the focus of philosophy inward, toward ethics and the examined life. Socrates' disciples recorded his conversations. In particular, Plato, one of his most devoted students, would write dialogues in which Socrates appears as the central figure. Through these dialogues, the Apology, the Republic, the Symposium, and many others, Plato explored justice, the ideal state, the nature of love, and the theory of forms, eternal, unchanging archetypes of which the things we perceive are mere shadows. Plato's vision of the philosopher king, ruling guided by wisdom rather than birth, would resonate through political thought for centuries. Among Plato's students was Aristotle, whose approach contrasted with his teachers. While Plato sought ideal realities beyond the empirical world, Aristotle grounded inquiry in observation. He catalogued plants and animals, analyzed political constitutions, and dissected arguments into formal categories. After his time at Plato's Academy, Aristotle founded his own school, the Lyceum, in Athens. There, he lectured as he walked in the covered walkways, hence his followers' name, the Peripatetics, from peripatos, walking place. Aristotle's writings on logic, ethics, metaphysics, rhetoric, poetry, and natural science formed a vast encyclopedia of knowledge. He introduced the syllogism, a formal method of deductive reasoning, and examined the causes of things material, formal, efficient, and final. Although some of his biological observations were erroneous, his insistence on classification and careful description set a standard for scientific method. His ethical treatises, exploring virtue as a mean between extremes, and happiness as the flourishing of one's nature, continued to shape moral philosophy. Parallel to philosophical inquiry, Greek mathematicians and astronomers pursued abstract patterns and the movements of the heavens. In the late 4th century BCE, Euclid of Alexandria wrote the Elements, a 13-book treatise that organized geometric knowledge into definitions, axioms, propositions, and proofs. Euclid's logical structure remained the template for mathematical presentation for 2 millennia. Astronomy saw similar advances. Aristarchus of Samos in the 3rd century BCE proposed that the Earth revolved around the Sun, predating Copernicus by nearly 1800 years. Though his heliocentric model was not widely accepted, his bold hypothesis marks the inventive spirit of Hellenistic science. Eratosthenes, also of Alexandria, measured the Earth's circumference by comparing the angles of the sun's rays at 2 different locations and calculating the distance between them. His remarkably accurate estimate testified to the power of simple geometry coupled with careful observation. Greek inventors applied theoretical knowledge to practical problems. Archimedes of Syracuse, in the 3rd century BCE, devised machines that remain legendary. The Archimedean screw for raising water, compound pulleys to lift heavy weights, and war machines that hurled projectiles or defended harbors with mirrors purportedly concentrating sunlight to ignite enemy ships. He discovered the principle of buoyancy, now called Archimedes' principle, by observing water displacement in his famous bath experiment. Though few of his machines survive, writings and later commentaries sketch their form and function. In public works, the Greeks built aqueducts to channel springs into cities, erected monumental bridges of stone, and engineered temples with precise proportions that created illusions of perfect symmetry. The Parthenon, for instance, incorporates subtle curvature in its stylobate, platform, and entasis, slight swelling of the columns, to counteract optical distortions. Such refinements reveal a sophisticated understanding of geometry, perspective, and human perception. While philosophers debated the nature of reality and scientists measured the earth, dramatists and poets explored the depths of the human condition. In the 5th century BCE, Athens hosted dramatic festivals where playwrights competed in tragedies and comedies. Aeschylus, often called the father of tragedy, added a second actor to the stage, enabling dialogue and conflict. His Orestia trilogy dramatized themes of justice, vengeance, and the founding of civic law. Sophocles, who lived into his 90s, further refined the genre, introducing a third actor and perfecting character development. His plays Oedipus Rex, Antigone, Electra probe fate, free will, and moral responsibility. Euripides, the youngest of the three, presented more psychological complexity and questioned traditional values in works like Medea and the Bacchae. Across from these tragedies, Aristophanes wrote comedies that satirized politicians, intellectuals, and social conventions, providing audiences with sharp humor and relief amid the seriousness of civic life. Beyond the theater, lyric poetry thrived. Sappho of Lesbos composed delicate verses of personal reflection and passion, though only fragments survive. Pindar celebrated athletic victors in odes that fused praise with religious reflection. Archilochus experimented with iambic meter to express anger and satire. Their work, performed with musical accompaniment, highlights the Greeks' sensitivity to language's rhythm, sound, and emotional resonance. In the realm of visual arts, Greek sculptors and painters strove for ideal proportions and lifelike representation. In the Archaic age, kouroi and kourai, stiff, frontal statues of youths, bore the characteristic archaic smile. By the classical era, sculptors like Phidias and Polykleitos achieved dynamic poses and realistic anatomy. Polykleitos codified the canon, a set of ideal mathematical proportions for the human body, while Phidias oversaw the sculptural program of the Parthenon, including the colossal Athena Parthenos. Greek vase painting also evolved. Geometric motifs gave way to the black figure technique of Corinth and Athens, in which silhouetted figures were incised to reveal details. Later, the red figure technique reversed this palette, allowing greater subtlety and movement. Scenes ranged from mythological narratives to daily life, athletes exercising, women at home, soldiers in battle, providing a visual record of customs and attire. Hellenistic sculptors ventured further into emotion and realism. The Laocoon group expresses agony in twisting bodies and strained muscles. The Nike of Samothrace captures the goddess of victory alighting on a prow, her drapery billowing in a non-existent wind. These works display not only technical mastery but a willingness to depict pathos, age, and the fleeting moment. Though the Greek city-states eventually succumbed to Macedonian and then Roman rule, their intellectual and artistic achievements lived on. Roman patrons collected Greek originals and commissioned copies for their villas. Late antique schools continued to teach Aristotle and Plato. In the Byzantine Empire, scholars preserved manuscripts of Greek philosophers, church fathers writing in Greek commenting on their texts. In the Islamic world, translators in Baghdad rendered Aristotle into Arabic, influencing medieval philosophy. In Western Europe, the Renaissance recovered Greek texts through Byzantine refugees and Crusader contacts, spawning a rebirth of learning. Thus, the fabric of Greek thought and art stretched across centuries and cultures. The questions of Thales, the dialogues of Plato, the tragedies of Sophocles, the geometry of Euclid, and the marble of Phidias wove themselves into the tapestry of Western civilization. They inform our concepts of democracy, ethics, drama, science, and beauty. They remind us that even amid wars and political upheavals, the human mind and spirit pursue understanding and expression, shaping a legacy as enduring as the stones of the Parthenon. As you rest, imagine the silent footsteps of Aristotle in the Lyceum, the hush before the chorus sings in the great amphitheater, the steady chisel of the sculptor at dawn, In those quiet acts of pondering, crafting, and performing, a current of inquiry and creativity flowed. A current that, though it began long ago, still carries its gentle momentum into our dreams and our waking lives.